saw her do it. I was standing no more than 20 feet away, half hidden behind a pillar draped in white tulle and baby's breath, and I watched my daughter-in-law crouch down beside the chair reserved for my wife and squeeze something from a small tube onto the seat cushion. She didn't see me. She thought I was still out front greeting the guests arriving from Kelowna. She was wrong. I stood there for a moment, just watching her cap the tube and slide it into the small clutch bag she was carrying, smooth her dress, and walk away like she hadn't just done something that could have put a 63-year-old woman with a replaced hip into the hospital. And I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't going to say a single word about it. Not yet. My name is not important for this story. But what's important is that I have been married to my wife, June, for 38 years. She grew up in a small town outside of Thunder Bay, the kind of woman who still sends handwritten thank you cards and keeps a spare key under a ceramic frog on the front porch for neighbors who might need it. She raised our son Tyler mostly on her own when I was working long stretches up north with the mining company. She drove him to hockey at 5 in the morning through Ontario winters without a single complaint. She showed up for every school play, every parent-teacher night, every single moment that mattered. June also had her left hip replaced 14 months before my son's wedding. She walks fine now mostly, but she gets stiff when she sits for too long in one position, and getting up quickly from a low chair can be difficult. Her surgeon had told us that for the next year or so, she needed to be careful about sudden twisting movements, the kind that happen when you stand up unexpectedly or shift your weight the wrong way. Her daughter-in-law, Amber, knew all of this. We had dinner at Tyler and Amber's place in Oakville back in February, and June had mentioned it herself. Amber had nodded and said she hoped June would be fully healed by the wedding. She'd said it with the warm smile she always used around us, the one that never quite reached her eyes. I should have paid more attention to that smile years earlier. But you don't want to believe certain things about the person your child has chosen to love. Tyler met Amber at a work conference in Toronto about 4 years before the wedding. She came from money, old money, the Muskoka cottage kind, and she made sure you knew it without ever saying it directly. Little things. The way she'd correct June's pronunciation of certain wine names, the way she'd mention, casually, that her family had been going to the same club in Rosedale for 3 generations. The way she'd look at our house in Sudbury, a perfectly good house, a house I had paid off and was proud of, with an expression she thought she was hiding. June never said a bad word about her. That was June. She bought Amber a silk scarf for her birthday, spent more than she should have. She offered to help address wedding invitations. She drove 4 hours down the 400 to help Amber with venue tastings, when Amber's own mother was traveling in Portugal. Amber received all of it like it was owed to her. I think the moment things started to crack, really crack, not just the surface tension I'd been watching, was about 6 weeks before the wedding. Tyler called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because Tyler usually texted. He said Amber felt the seating arrangement at the head table was getting complicated and that it might be better if June and I sat at the family table near the back of the room rather than at the head table beside him. I asked him to repeat that. He repeated it. I said, Tyler, your mother drove 4 hours every other weekend for the last 3 months to help plan this wedding. He said, Dad, Amber's family is larger and they have a lot of expectations about the seating, and the head table is limited. I asked how many seats were at the head table. He said 12. I said, so there is no room for your mother at the table at your wedding. There was a long pause, and then he said the thing that told me everything. He said, Amber's Aunt Renee is coming from Vancouver, and it's really important to Amber that... I told him I needed to think about it. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time. June was upstairs. She'd been wrapping a gift she'd ordered for them, a handmade quilt from a woman in Manitoulin Island who did custom work, something she'd been planning for months. I didn't tell her about the phone call that night. In the end, I agreed to the family table. For June's sake, She wanted to be at that wedding more than anything. It was still her son getting married, whatever else was happening around it. So we smiled, we dressed up, we drove down to the venue outside of Hamilton, a converted farm property that rented for more than I want to think about, and we found our seats at the table near the east window, which was actually quite nice, if I'm being honest, with a view of the apple orchard along the property line. Our seats were marked with small white cards. June's chair was the one with the blush pink bow on the back. Amber had specifically assigned June that chair, which I thought was a kind gesture at the time. I know now it was not a kind gesture. So there I was, standing by that pillar, watching my daughter-in-law walk away from the chair she'd just coated with industrial strength adhesive, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor of the reception hall. I waited until she rounded the corner toward the bridal suite. Then I walked over to the table. I leaned down and looked at the seat cushion. There was a faint sheen on the fabric, barely visible. But there, I touched it with the back of my finger, very lightly, and my finger caught slightly when I lifted it. Not much. Enough. I stood up and looked at the seating cards. The layout was simple. On June's left was me. On her right was Tyler's chair, then Amber's, the four of us at one end of the table, nearest the orchard window. I picked up Amber's place card and set it where June's had been. I moved June's card to where Amber's had been, shifting Tyler's to keep the spacing natural. Then I walked to the other side of the table, picked up the blush bow from the back of June's original chair, and tied it onto the chair I'd now placed her card in front of. I went outside and found June talking to my brother-in-law, Harold, near the fire pit. She looked beautiful. She was wearing the deep blue dress we picked out together at the bay in Sudbury, and she'd done something with her hair that made her look like she had in our wedding photos from 1987. I offered her my arm and said, "Ready, sweetheart?" She smiled and said, "Oh, I've been ready for an hour, you know me." We went inside. The ceremony was held in the garden, and it was genuinely lovely. Tyler cried when June walked past him to her seat, and I watched his face do something complicated. Love and guilt fighting it out right there in public. And I thought, he's not entirely gone. The boy I know is still in there somewhere. Afterward came the cocktail hour, then the reception hall, then dinner. June and I found our seats. She settled in comfortably and said the chair was nice and firm, not like some wedding chairs that are basically folding disasters padded with foam. The thickness of a slice of bread. I agreed that yes, it was a very good chair. Across the table, Amber sat down in the chair with the blush bow. I picked up my water glass and watched Amber over the rim. She was laughing at something one of her cousins had said, tossing her hair back the way she did when she wanted to look effortless. She shifted a little in her seat, adjusted her posture, made a small expression. Not pain, not concern. Adjusted her posture. That she smoothed away quickly. She'd felt it. The fabric catching just slightly, the way adhesive feels when it's beginning to bond. But she didn't know what it was, not yet. The dinner went on. It was a 4-course meal. Caesar salad, a soup, a choice of tenderloin or halibut, and dessert. The caterer was from Burlington and was genuinely excellent. June had the halibut and said it was the best she'd had since we went to Nova Scotia in 2019. I had the tenderloin. Every time Amber shifted in her chair, I watched her expression flicker. Once she looked down at the seat cushion for just a moment, then back up. She said something quietly to Tyler, who leaned over and listened, then shrugged and said something back. Whatever she told him, he didn't take it seriously. Good. The speeches came after the main course. Tyler's best man, a guy named Parker, whom I'd met twice and liked both times, gave a speech that was funny in all the right places and sincere in the right places too. He talked about Tyler's loyalty, which landed a bit differently in my chest than it might have otherwise. June laughed at the jokes and dabbed her eye at the sentimental parts. and she was completely unaware that anything unusual had happened or was about to. That was exactly how I wanted it. Then came the part of the evening that wedding MCs in Ontario seem to love, the moment where they call the wedding party to their feet for various ceremonial reasons. The first dance introduction, the cake-cutting procession, the bridal toast. The MC was a cheerful man in his mid-40s, named, according to the program, Jeff, and he had the practiced energy of someone who did this 40 weekends a year. He had a wireless microphone and good instincts for reading a room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jeff said after the dessert plates had been cleared, "before we open the floor for dancing, I'd like to invite our beautiful bride to stand so we can all raise a glass to the woman who somehow convinced our groom that he was worthy." Laughter from the room. I set down my fork. Amber reached down and placed both hands on the edge of the table to push herself to standing. This is what people do without thinking about it. They brace on the nearest surface and rise. What they don't do, what Amber did not do, was think about the fact that the back panel of her gown, a fitted floor-length dress with a structured skirt, in what I believe is called crepe fabric, had been bonded over the course of the last 2.5 hours to the chair beneath her. The sound. I will tell you honestly that I was not prepared for the sound. I expected something, a resistance, a visible awkwardness, Amber struggling slightly and maybe needing to be helped. What I got instead was a sound that went through that reception hall like a thunderclap in a library, a single, catastrophic tearing, loud enough that the guests at the far end of the room went silent and turned their heads. Amber stood. And then she stood there, the back panel of her dress, from just below the waist to the top of the chair back, had separated from the rest of the gown in a clean, devastating line. What was exposed was not indecent, fortunately. She was wearing what is typically called shapewear, the firm, high-waisted foundation garments that many women wear under formal dresses. It covered everything that needed covering, but it was white and stark and visible to approximately 140 guests, and there was absolutely no ambiguity about what had happened. Jeff, to his professional credit, went completely silent. First time all night. The table nearest to us, Amber's mother's table, erupted first. Her mother stood up, knocking her chair back, hand over her mouth. 3 of her cousins turned to look at each other. One of Amber's bridesmaids made a sound that she clearly did not intend to make out loud. Tyler was staring at the chair, and then at Amber, and then at the strip of crepe fabric still bonded to the cushion, and then back at Amber. His face went through about 6 different expressions in about 4 seconds, none of them ones I could easily name. June beside me had her hand pressed flat to her sternum. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "Oh, that poor thing. That's my wife." What happened next was managed with more grace than it deserved, honestly. One of the bridesmaids threw a linen napkin around Amber's waist immediately. Another produced a pashmina from somewhere. 2 of the venue staff appeared with a folding screen within about 3 minutes. They'd clearly dealt with clothing emergencies before. Amber was escorted behind the screen, and after about 20 minutes, she emerged in what appeared to be a different dress, a simpler one, that someone had retrieved from the bridal suite. She looked composed. Pale, but composed. She did not look at June's chair for the rest of the evening. She did not look at me at all. Tyler was another story. At some point during the chaos, while the bridesmaids were managing the situation and Jeff was doing his best to warm the room back up with light patter about wedding day surprises, my son came around the table to crouch beside the chair. He ran his finger along the cushion. He looked up and found me. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Whatever calculation was running behind his eyes, I let it run. He stood up. He looked at his mother. June was talking to Harold's wife, Patsy, and hadn't seen Tyler crouching by the chair. Tyler looked at his mother for a long time, and then he went back to his seat. The dancing started. June and I danced twice, once to an old Anne Murray song the DJ played by request. which I had submitted in advance. And June laughed and said she couldn't believe I still remembered how to two-step. I said I had my moments. We left at 10:30, which was sensible for people our age, and June fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere around Brantford. The drive home gave me time to think. I want to be clear about something. I have never in my life done anything like what I did that evening. I'm a straightforward person. I pay my taxes on time. I've never had so much as a parking ticket that I left unpaid. I return shopping carts. What I did was calculated and deliberate, and I would do it again, because here is what I did not tell June. What Amber had planned would not have been a humiliation. It would have been an injury. June's surgeon had told her specifically that a sudden, forced, asymmetrical load on her hip joint, exactly the kind that happens when a person tries to stand and finds themselves unexpectedly anchored to a chair, could cause a subluxation, a partial dislocation, in the best case, severe pain and a long recovery. In the worst case, back to surgery. Amber knew about the hip. She had been at that dinner table in February. 2 weeks after the wedding, I called Tyler. He answered on the second ring, which was different from the weeks before the wedding, when it sometimes took him 2 days to call back. I told him I needed to say something, and I needed him to listen without interrupting. He said okay. I told him what I had seen. I described it simply without editorializing. I told him what the tube looked like, what the substance had done to the chair, what it could have done to his mother's hip. I told him I had taken photographs of the damaged cushion after the evening ended with my phone and that I had kept them. I told him I had also spoken to a lawyer, a former colleague of mine, whose son had gone to Osgood Hall and now practiced civil law in Barry, about what options existed if June had been harmed. Tyler was quiet for a long time. I told him I was not calling to threaten anyone. I was calling because he needed to know what his wife had done, from someone who had seen it with his own eyes, and because I needed him to understand that there was a version of this evening in which his mother went to the hospital from his wedding in an ambulance, and that version had been a choice someone had made. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't. That's the only reason I'm having this conversation instead of a different one." We talked for almost 2 hours. It was the longest phone call Tyler and I had had since he was 17 and going through a hard stretch in school. I won't share everything that was said, some of it belongs to us. What I will say is that he cried, which I had not heard him do since he was small, and that I found it harder to hear than I expected. I also made 2 changes to my affairs in the weeks following. My wife and I have a modest RRSP and some property, the house in Sudbury, and a small piece of land near Timagami that my father left me. I had been meaning to update the paperwork for some time, and that fall I updated it. Tyler remains in the documents. The structure simply reflects some new thinking about what responsible estate planning actually looks like and what it means to protect the people who deserve protecting. Amber and Tyler are still married. I don't know what the inside of that marriage looks like now. What I know is that Tyler called June on her birthday in October by himself, without prompting, and talked to her for 45 minutes. He asked about her hip. He asked about her garden. He told her he missed her cooking. June hung up the phone and sat quietly at the kitchen table for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "He sounds different." I said, "Good different or bad different?" She thought about it and said, "Like himself, actually. Like the boy I know." I squeezed her hand. I didn't say anything else. Some things you carry quietly, and some things you let go, knowing which is which. That's the part that takes 60 years to learn. I've thought about that evening more times than I expected to. Not with anger, that part faded somewhere on the drive home along the 403, with June asleep in the passenger seat and the radio playing quietly. What stayed with me was something quieter and harder to name. Here's what I've come to understand. What happened that night wasn't really about superglue or a torn dress. It was about choices. The kind people make when they believe no one is paying attention, and the kind you have to make when you realize you've been paying attention to the wrong things for far too long. Amber made a choice that evening. A deliberate one, and choices like that don't come from nowhere. They come from years of small decisions. Small moments where a person chooses convenience over decency, where they let themselves believe that other people's dignity matters less than their own comfort. That's not something that happens overnight. It's something that grows slowly, in the space where honesty should have been. Tyler made choices too. He chose the easier road for a long time, and I understand it more than I let on. Keeping the peace is seductive. It looks like loyalty. It feels like life, but there's a version of keeping the peace that is really just keeping yourself comfortable while the people you are supposed to protect absorb the cost. That's not wisdom. That's avoidance dressed up in reasonable clothing. What I did that night, switching those place cards, saying nothing, waiting, wasn't clever in the way a plan is clever. It was patient. And patience, I've learned, is not passive. It's a decision to let the truth arrive on its own schedule rather than forcing it into a shape it doesn't fit. I stayed clear-headed when my instinct was to react. I thought about what June needed, not just what I needed in that moment. That's the only kind of thinking that actually helps. What I want to say, and I mean this for anyone who finds themselves in a situation where they've been quietly overlooked, where someone has mistaken their kindness for weakness, is that holding yourself together in the middle of something unfair is one of the hardest things a person can do. It takes more out of you than yelling does. It takes a certain stubbornness of character, a refusal to become someone. You're not just because someone else is behaving badly. That refusal is worth protecting. June never became someone she wasn't. 38 years, and she has never once let someone else's cruelty turn her into a lesser version of herself. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. And Tyler, I think he always had it in him. The phone call on June's birthday told me that. The boy I raised was still there underneath whatever had accumulated over those years. He just needed the truth to arrive without a door slamming behind it. Some things you carry quietly, and some things you let go. Knowing which is which. That's the part that takes 60 years to learn.